Hello everyone, welcome back to Ancient Greece and Rome. In this video, we're going to discuss ancient Greek society during the High and later Classical period, from about 449 BCE to about 336 BCE, basically from the end of the Persian War to the Macedonian Greek takeover of the Greek city-states. We'll talk about some cultural trends, things like architecture, pottery, sculpture, theater. We'll also talk about philosophy, ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, who were active during this period. We'll talk about military history as well, the Peloponnesian War, what leads to the Peloponnesian War, and the effects of the Peloponnesian War, particularly how the Peloponnesian War weakened the Greek city-states, especially Athens and Sparta, and greatly facilitated the Macedonian takeover of Greece. And then we'll finish the video by talking about how the Macedonians under Philip II and Alexander the Great were able to take over the Greek city-states. We'll discuss Macedonian culture, society, some of the differences between Macedonia and other Greek city-states, Greek cultures, and how ultimately Macedonia was able to basically unite most of the Greek city-states under their rule. Before we begin our discussion of the High and later Classical period, I want to talk a little bit about the Greeks' role in the development of history, the discipline that I practice. One of the most important Greek historians, arguably the father of history, was Herodotus. He wrote a work called The Histories, or The History of the Persian War. Herodotus was from Halicarnassus, which is in Anatolia, so it's not in the Greek mainland, it's in what is now Turkey. He wrote his histories and finished it about the year 425 BCE. And he tried to explain the conflict between the Greek city-states and Persia as a conflict between East and West, the Greeks being the West, being Europe, and then the Persians being Asia in the East. And he writes about the cultural differences between the Greeks and the Persians. Of course, as you know from our last discussion, some Greeks actually fought on the Persian side. Some of the Ionian Greeks were pressed into service in the Achaemenid Persian military, and actually the Macedonians fought on the Persian side during the Persian Wars, which will be important later. Herodotus tries to be objective, but ultimately I think he sides more with the Greeks in the end. Some scholars question the authenticity of many of Herodotus' stories. He mentions very bizarre, outlandish things like ants that mine gold, in places like India. He mentions men with dog faces, men with heads in their chests. Some of his stories, especially about sub-Saharan Africa, seem to be fabricated. They don't seem to be very realistic. These, of course, arose from the fact that Herodotus did not travel to every place that he wrote about. He used a lot of reports and testimonies from other people. Either way, though, his histories are actually very useful, and some of his stories, not the ones like about gold mining ants and dog-faced men, have actually been corroborated by later historical and archaeological inquiry. So there are some issues with Herodotus' work, but I still believe he deserves the title the father of history, and anyone who wants to consider themselves to be a historian should take time to read Herodotus' The Histories. But with that, we'll get back to our discussion of High and later Classical Greek culture. One of the greatest examples of later Classical Greek architecture, and possibly of all Greek architecture, is the Parthenon of Athens. It is later Classical Greek architecture at its finest. The Parthenon and the Temple of Athena and the buildings around it are an amalgamation of earlier Doric and Ionic orders, but they're of the highest form. You can really see by looking at the Parthenon and surrounding buildings that classical Greek architects had really mastered their craft. There's also some new innovations in the Parthenon complex as well, most notably the caryatids, which combine elements of classical Greek architecture and sculpture. The architectural style of the Parthenon, its fusion of Doric and Ionic styles, reflects the values of later classical Athenian society: democracy, a degree of cosmopolitan, and even interest in empire. We'll talk more about Athenian culture later in the video. The Parthenon complex was built on top of the Acropolis of Athens. The Acropolis was a high hill in the center of the city. The Acropolis takes its name from the Greek words akron and polis, meaning highest point in the city. During the Bronze Age, it was probably a Mycenaean citadel, based on documentary sources and archaeological discoveries at the site. There had been temples, including a temple to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and the official patron goddess of Athens, on the Acropolis, but this original temple was probably destroyed by the Persians during their invasion of the city, during the Persian War. After the Persian Wars had come to an end, the Temple of Athena was rebuilt using the wealth of the city of Athens. This construction project took place from roughly 460 to 406 BCE. Here is a rendering of the Acropolis site before the building of the Parthenon. As you can see, there's an old temple to Athena at the center of the complex, and there's roads that connect the Acropolis to the city itself, as well as a wall. The Acropolis may have been used as a fortress into which the old residents of Athens, or the residents of old Athens, could flee during invasions. But it was destroyed during the Persian War because the Achaemenid forces were so powerful they were able to capture not only the city of Athens, but the Acropolis as well. The site was probably occupied in Mycenaean times, as shown by artifacts found nearby, like this statue of a Mycenaean soldier wearing the official boar tusk helmet worn by Mycenaean warriors. Here's some additional images of the Parthenon site and the Acropolis. As you can see, the Acropolis towers over the modern city of Athens, making it a strategically important high point. You can also see the foundations of the buildings that were built at the Acropolis, once again highlighting that the Acropolis was continuously occupied for centuries before the famous Parthenon was constructed. As mentioned before, Persian forces of the Achaemenid Empire destroyed the original temple to Athena on the Acropolis sometime between 480 and 479 BCE. Here is an artist's rendering of what the original temple to Athena may have looked like. As you can see, it's much smaller and plainer than the temple that would be built later on. Here is a floor plan of the original temple to Athena and then the later temple to Athena that was built as part of the Parthenon complex. The original temple is in black. The Parthenon temple is in gray, and you can see it's much larger and grander than the original temple that was destroyed. In the years following the Persian Wars, leaders in Athens wanted to rebuild the temple to Athena and rebuild the Acropolis. They also wanted to add increased fortifications to the city to prevent future destruction in the case of a potential future Persian invasion, or even an invasion from another Greek city-state, possibly Sparta. We'll talk more about the Spartans later. Much of the rebuilding was done under Pericles, the most famous Athenian leader. Pericles oversaw the construction of the Parthenon and other temples at Athens during a period that's often called the Athenian Golden Age, from about the 460s to the 430s BCE. This was a time in which Athens was very wealthy. They defeated their enemies, the Achaemenid Empire. They were seeing increased trade with other Greek city-states and with colonies in other parts of the Mediterranean region. And the Athenians had discovered silver mines, which were bringing a lot of wealth into the city-state. It was also a time of great cultural achievement for the Athenians as well. We see that Athenian theater reaches its height during the early 400s BCE. We also see that the most famous Greek philosophers, including Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, begin their work in the 400s BCE. We'll talk more about Athenian theater and philosophers later in this video. The Parthenon, the temple to Athena, was built from roughly 447 to 432 BCE. It was proposed by the Athenian leader Pericles, shown here at left. The temple was built not only to honor Athena, the goddess of Athens, but to symbolize the power, wealth, and cultural achievement of the city of Athens and its people. As I said before, the Parthenon is a fusion of Doric and Ionic orders, highlighting the cosmopolitanism of the city of Athens. The classical Greeks could be very insular at times, often rejecting non-Greek civilizations, especially after the Persian Wars, in which the Persians had nearly destroyed their civilization. But Athens still showed an element of cosmopolitanism and an openness to other cultures besides their own, partially because of the wealth of the city and because they wanted to trade with other city-states and other cultures. Other city-states, like Sparta, would remain much more insular, even xenophobic, compared to Athens. Here's an architectural diagram of the Parthenon, which showcases the fusion of the Doric and Ionic orders in the temple edifice. You can see that the capitals and the columns, or rather the shafts of the columns, are of the Doric order, but most of the other architectural features are much more of the Ionic order, being more ornate and decorative. Here are some artists' reconstructions of what the Parthenon may have looked like during the 400s BCE. As you can see, the white marble has been painted with a variety of colors. These colors have long since faded away. You can also see the precious metals that are inlaid throughout the building's structure to highlight the wealth of the city of Athens. These images show the intricacy and skill of Greek architects during the classical period. Here are some images of the reconstructive work and restorative work that's being done on the Parthenon. This is a very difficult task. It's a balance of architectural research and inquiry with respecting the importance and the sanctity of the original site to the modern people of Greece. Also, we should keep in mind that the Parthenon has been nearly continuously used for centuries, even after the Greek civilization lost its independence. For example, the Parthenon was used as a Christian church, and when the Ottoman Turks took over Greece, they used the Parthenon as a site to store gunpowder. Some of the gunpowder actually exploded in the 1600s CE and caused a significant amount of damage to the Parthenon. I also want to talk about the genius and creativity of Iktinos, the architect who designed the Parthenon, as well as the skill of the workers who built this beautiful work of monumental Greek architecture. Ictinos built the Parthenon according to the golden ratio, which is a mathematical concept about beauty and proportions. Ictinos also built the Parthenon not perfectly straight. For example, the shafts of the columns, they're a little bit wider at the base and they get a bit narrower as they go up. This was designed to make the Parthenon look straight and perfect to the eye of the beholder. So he was really concerned with proportions, but also how this temple looked to people visiting it. If Ictinos had built the columns completely straight, they would not have actually looked straight to the human viewer. Also, what's very interesting is how many of the stones are held together on the Parthenon. Basically, the stones are not held together with mortar. They're held together with basically iron poles, a lot like modern-day rebar, if you're familiar with modern architecture. These poles would then be covered in lead, and the lead would keep the iron from basically rusting. You know, this is close to the sea. You have those Aegean sea breezes. The salt would have caused the iron to rust, which would have caused the Parthenon to collapse. And this is something that restorers of the Parthenon did not realize. They did not realize that the original classical Greeks covered the iron in lead. Lead, of course, would protect the iron from rusting. And this design, not only is it a beautiful design, there's no mortar, ugly looking mortar visible, it allows the Parthenon to flex a little bit because Greece is a very seismically active region. There's a lot of earthquakes. Flexibility will allow a building to better survive earthquakes. So another just example of the genius of the Parthenon architect and then the workers who constructed this building. It's also another reason for why the restoration of the Parthenon has been ongoing for decades, just because of how sophisticated of a building it is. Here's a diagram showing some of the other buildings that were built on the Acropolis of Athens following the Parthenon. You can see the Erechtheion and the Propylaea and the Temple of Athena Nike. We discussed some of these buildings in a previous lecture, but we'll go over some of their architectural features in more detail here. Here is the facade of the Propylaea. It's mostly of the Doric order. You'll notice the very simple but very clean style of the Doric capitals. You'll notice the very wide fluting on the shafts of these Doric columns. You'll notice the triglyphs as well, very iconic parts of Doric architecture and very good examples of the Doric style on the Propylaea. Here's a shot of the Erechtheion, which includes elements of both the Doric and the Ionic orders, as you can see. It also includes another architectural innovation using statues as columns, as seen here with the caryatids. We'll talk more about the caryatids on the next slide. The caryatids were a fusion of Greek sculpture and architectural traditions. The caryatids, statues of women, were more lifelike in detail than those of the archaic and early classical periods that we looked at in a previous video. These statues highlight the increasing skill of Greek sculptors during the later classical period, the Greek Golden Age. Like the Parthenon building, these statues would have originally been painted, although the paint has long since faded away. Scholars believe that these statues, the caryatids, were intended to represent the women of Athens. As they bravely supported their men during the Persian War. Here are some artists' renderings of what the caryatids may have looked like, painted. The colors are very bright. They almost look gaudy to us today, but to the classical Greeks, this painting would have made the statues look even more realistic and lifelike. Here are some reconstructions of the statue of Athena Parthenos. Athena Parthenos would have been the statue inside the Parthenon. It's believed that the original statue of Athena, Parthenos, was not made of marble, but of a combination of cypress wood, ivory, and gold, as seen on the right. The left image is a Roman copy of the original statue. Roman sculptors often like to copy earlier Greek statues. Here's what the statue of Athena, Parthenos, would have looked like, placed in the interior of the Parthenon. As mentioned before, the original statue has been lost, and so archaeologists and scholars have had to have guessed what the statue would have looked like. Now I want to talk a little bit more about some of Pericles' other activities during his time in Athens, during his life. In addition to commissioning a series of public works projects like the Parthenon, Pericles also called for a series of political reforms, including stipends for poor jurymen. Stipends were important for poor men because they would spend a lot of time sitting on juries rather than working, and they needed to have some money coming in while they were basically serving on the juries. And this was actually a very radical move and a very egalitarian move, as it allowed more poor men to take part in Athenian democracy. He also changed what it took to become a citizen in Athens. He actually made it a bit more difficult to become a citizen. He said that men who wanted to be citizens had to prove that both of their parents, both their mother and their father, had been born in Athens. Previously, it only really mattered that their father had been born in Athens. Once again, Greece is a very patriarchal society, so this is actually in some ways kind of a progressive move, because it means that it matters not only who your father is, but who your mother is as well, even if it does mean it's more difficult to become a citizen, something that people might say is xenophobic. It's the duality of Greek society, the complexity of Greek society. Pericles also oversaw the Delian League's transformation into an empire, and we'll talk more about what the Delian League was in Athens later in this video. And of course, Pericles will lead Athens in the Delian League against Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. He'll establish a grand strategy that Athens will use that plays to Athenian strengths. But unfortunately for Pericles, and certainly unfortunately for Athens as well, Pericles dies prematurely from a disease, from a plague that afflicts the city of Athens during the war. Basically, in summation, Pericles made Athenian society and politics a lot more democratic and egalitarian. But he also made democracy more exclusive as well. This is the duality of Greek culture. Pericles' supporters saw him as a man of the people, but his opponents accused him of being a demagogue. Now we'll discuss ancient Greek theater, a major cultural contribution of the ancient Greek people, alongside things like democracy and philosophy. Theatrical productions probably predated later classical Greece, but they really reached their peak, their zenith, during the later classical period. There are many styles of classical Greek theater, but the two most important by far were comedies and tragedies. Comedies had a happy ending. They were not always laugh out loud funny, although many of them are still hilarious. Tragedies, true to their name, had a sad ending and dealt with much more serious themes. Some of the most important tragic playwrights were Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles. Perhaps the most important comic playwright was Aristophanes. Tragedies tended to depict humans as more honorable and noble than they were in reality. They were meant to inspire and galvanize audiences who were dealing with a variety of problems in their daily lives. Comedies, however, were meant to lampoon contemporary Greek leaders and movements, especially warlike politicians and philosophers, who often seemed to be out of touch with everyday Greek people. Both of these groups became the butt of jokes in comedies. Theater was important in many Greek city-states, but it was especially important in Athens, as seen by the Theater of Dionysus site in Athens. shown on the right-hand side of this slide. Architects of ancient Greek theaters often built theaters into the sides of hills so that the stands could be constructed more easily, and because the hill would provide natural acoustics to amplify the voices of the actors. Later theaters often contained backstage areas where props could be stored and actors could change masks and costumes. These backstage areas also held equipment for special effects, basic special effects, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. Here are some additional images of the Theater of Dionysus in Athens. As you can see, the stands are built into a hill. The stands are built this way so that people in the back rows are able to see the performance. Also, the hill will provide an element of amplification for the actors so that the audience can hear what they're saying. There's also a reconstruction of what the theater may have looked like when it was used in classical times. The stands are full of spectators of the show, and the cast stands on the stage presenting the play. Ancient Greek theater was especially known for its use of masks. Although ancient Greeks would not have called them masks, they would have called them a prosopon, literally meaning face. Masks were important because theatrical production casts were usually very small. There were usually only about 3 lead actors who would play all the major roles by rotating masks and costumes. In ancient Greek theater, men generally played all the leading roles, much like Shakespearean theater centuries later. By the time of the Hellenistic period, though, women began to play minor roles. Ancient Greek plays often included a chorus, a group of people who would sing and recite poetry, and they functioned as a narrator for the plot of the play. Choruses were especially important in tragedies. The masks worn by ancient Greek actors were initially very exaggerated in features, and they would become more lifelike over time. On the left-hand side of the slide are some older masks from both comedies and tragedies. Tragic masks usually have a sad or angry face, while comedic masks tend to have a smiling face. On the right is a much newer mask, believed to be of Zeus, which is much more realistic. Ancient Greek theater used other types of props as well, including costumes, and there were basic special effects that were made in the backstage area, like lowering a cast member from a scaffold, which was called the Deus Ex Machina, God from the machine. A theatrical term that's still in use today. Although the ancient Greeks generally enjoyed theater, actors were not respected and were often viewed as dishonest, being little better than prostitutes, because they sold themselves, pretending to be other people. Here are some additional examples of Greek theatrical masks. They'd be made from clay and then painted to look more realistic, and then they'd be tied to the face with leather straps. And of course, different types of masks were used for tragedies and comedies. There were also masks for male characters and female characters. Remember, early on in Greek theater, men played all of the roles. It's not until more like the Hellenistic period when women actually begin to play the roles of women in Greek theater. Now I want to briefly talk about some of the types of Greek theatrical productions. Very briefly, you could teach an entire course just on ancient Greek theater. We'll start by talking about tragedies. Tragedies in Greek theatrical culture were focused on the flaws of humans and the importance of obeying the gods and resisting human urges. Typically, in tragedies, humans are portrayed as very noble but very flawed, and as being basically less noble than the gods, and that they need to listen to the gods and obey the gods if they want to have a good life. And the name tragedy actually comes from Tragoyeda, which means goat song. Basically, we think that goat herders out in the hills of Greece, they would sing these kind of sad, baleful songs about life while they were alone watching the goats. And this kind of evolved into tragic theater. They may have also been based on older Dionysian fertility rituals, basically rituals that were designed to honor Dionysus, the god of wine and festivities. This is especially evident in Euripides' play, the Bacchae, which is about worshippers of Dionysus. The first tragedian was Thespis, from which we get the term thespian or actor, but only the works of later playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, have survived in full. And the lead player in the tragedies is called the protagonist. And of course, actors wore masks. They also wore platform shoes called buskins to make themselves look taller than they actually were. And they even used special effects like the Mechane for the Deus Ex Machina scene, where the god out of the machine, the god would come down, and that would be the climax of the play. And this is, of course, a bust of Aeschylus from the Naples Museum. Now I want to talk about Athenian comedy, which develops a little bit later than Greek tragedy. Specifically, I want to talk about Aristophanes, probably the most famous Athenian comedian. Aristophanes lived from 455 to 386 BCE, and he wrote comedic plays to satirize current events like the Peloponnesian War, philosophy. Contemporary figures like Pericles and Socrates also are mocked by Aristophanes as well. And his plays were generally very popular with everyday Greek people who liked to watch their leaders be mocked and lampooned. But a lot of powerful people in Greek society did not like what Aristophanes was doing. But Aristophanes mocked everybody. He mocked the Athenians, he mocked the Spartans. He pulled no punches. He didn't just mock one side or one group. Some of his most famous plays are The Clouds, 423 BCE, in which he mocks Socrates and philosophers and philosophy as being a bunch of kind of empty-headed people who just waste time and act smart but are really just kind of dishonest. And then there's the Lysistrata, which is about the Peloponnesian War. And specifically, Aristophanes mocks the men of Athens and Sparta and their failure to make peace during the Peloponnesian War. He features the women of Athens and Sparta working together to have a sex strike against their husbands, to force their husbands to make peace and to end the war. And scholars argue that these plays, especially comedies, had what is called a cathartic effect. And catharsis is a Greek word for cleaning or bathing, and that it allowed the Greeks an opportunity to criticize things they didn't like in their culture without having to resort to violence. And this is going to be very different because later Greek theater is not going to be nearly as bold and as risky. I also want to talk a little bit more about daily life in classical Greece. And some of these things are actually true of other periods in Greek history, like the earlier Archaic period, and even a little bit later into the Hellenistic period. We'll talk a little bit about housing and family life in particular. Ancient Greeks of all classes generally lived in houses of a similar structure, reflecting the kind of egalitarian trend of the Greek city-states. The size of the house did vary a little bit, though, based on the economic status of the resident. So it wasn't completely uniform, but you don't see wealthy people, at least in the classical period, living in these massive, huge, sprawling palaces. You see even wealthier people, people like Pericles, living not that much differently than middle class or even poorer Athenians. And the same is true of Sparta as well. with their kings and their elders not living that much differently than the everyday Spartan citizen. But basically, these houses were centered around a courtyard with rooms for different activities. And there were very clearly defined men's and women's spaces in these houses. While Greek society may have prided itself on egalitarianism when it came to class, it was very unegalitarian, very stratified when it came to gender. There were clear women's spaces and clear men's spaces. And in the home, women were supposed to serve and defer to the men in their lives. Here's a diagram of a Greek house. Typically, these houses had 2 stories. Sometimes they didn't, but if the family was wealthy enough, the house would have 2 stories. And usually the upper stories were more for private use, private spaces. Bedrooms would be on the 2nd floor, as you can see. The gynoeceum, the women's space, a private space, would be on the 2nd floor. In the gynoeceum, women would take care of the children, and they would engage in domestic production for the household, particularly weaving on a loom, as you can see here. And then these tapestries would be used to decorate the house. Generally, Greek houses were not super decorated. They would use tapestries, and there might be some paintings, but the idea was if a Greek person was wealthy enough to have a lot of decorations in their home, they actually would not even pay to have them in their home. They would instead pay to have a fresco made for the public to view rather than keeping it in their home, which was meant to be a bit more of a private space. The courtyard would feature a well where the family would get water from. These homes did not have like running water and plumbing the way later Roman homes would have. Instead, people would get their water from a well if they could afford to have a well dug. They would have to have the waste, garbage and things like that, taken away. They would actually pay workers or slaves to kind of come and clean up their waste, kind of like garbage men. There's a kitchen in these homes, and then there's the andron. The andron is the men's space, and men would collect in the andron. They would have their male friends over, and women did not enter the andron during parties unless they were there to serve or entertain the men. Basically, Greek men did not invite their wives or their daughters to their dinner parties. Their dinner parties were called symposia. We'll talk more about symposia later. Instead, they would hire women to serve them. Female slaves might serve them, or they would hire companions, basically sex workers, to come and entertain them at their symposia parties. And here's another example of a Greek home. It features an altar. A lot of homes had altars in the courtyard where the gods could be worshipped privately by the family. In addition to larger public rituals, the Greeks also believed in worshiping at home as well. There's separate storerooms for economic production. There's kitchens, bedrooms. There's the andron dining room, and there's also bathrooms. Basically, the bathroom did not have indoor plumbing. The water would have to be brought in, and as I said, waste would have to be carried out. Here is an excavation of a Greek house in Thebes. As you can see, there's separate rooms where certain activities would have taken place. There's compartmentalization, basically, in these houses. Here's an excavation of a Greek house in Western Greece, where once again you see multiple rooms for different activities. This is a trend you'll see in Greek houses. They're not just building one-room houses. They're not building open concept houses like we have today. They have courtyards, and then they have very clearly defined kind of rooms for certain activities. And this is an excavation of a Greek house in Sicily, where Sicily there's Greek colonies in Sicily, and even in the colonies they're living and building kind of homes in a similar fashion, kind of an example of that pan-Hellenic culture being spread outside of Greece. Here's a piece of red figure pottery showing a scene from the gynoeceum. women sitting together, socializing, getting dressed. These are things that women would have done privately because of the patriarchal nature of Greek society. Women had to have privacy where they could socialize amongst themselves. They were not permitted to socialize publicly the way men were. Here is a drawing of an andron. Basically, the androns had a series of couches along the wall. At these dinner parties, at these symposia, Greek men would eat while they reclined, and they would drink wine, and they would talk amongst each other. They would recite poetry, they would talk about current events, and they would be entertained by women, but not by their wives or by their sisters or daughters. They would be entertained by either slave women or women they'd hired, like prostitutes, who would come to the symposia. Here is a reconstruction of what an andron might have looked like. Notice the couches along the wall, oil lamps to provide light, because these dinner parties would have been taking place at different times of the day, earlier in the day or at night. There's a lyre on the wall because music was often performed, dancing was often done at these parties, and then all kinds of food and drink, especially wine, would have been served at these parties. Remember, the Greek diet is heavily based on the Mediterranean Trinity. That is wheat made into bread, olive oil, which is used as a seasoning, and then grapes, either eaten as fruit, seen here, or fermented into wine. And occasionally there would be proteins and other things like meat that would be eaten alongside this Mediterranean Trinity. This is a red figure crater. A crater is like a punch bowl that would hold wine that had been mixed with fruit, a popular beverage at symposia. And this is from the 420s, and it features a companion, or basically someone who's paid to be there, playing the aulos, which is a type of flute. We'll talk more about music and kind of gender roles in music on a later slide. Here is a modern artist's recreation of what a symposium may have looked like. You see the guests are all male. The only women that are in attendance are there to serve the men. There's musicians, there's dancers, and then there are companions there to entertain the men. A couple more interesting points about symposia. These symposia were parties where men ate, drank alcohol, socialized away from their wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters. I guess it was sort of the man cave experience. The andron was the man cave of the ancient Greek man, and then the symposia was a party where men would get together. And perhaps today men might watch sports and eat chicken wings and drink beer, but in classical Greece, men would instead drink wine and have entertainment brought in by companions and by female musicians. High-class female sex workers called companions would play musical instruments, and they would sing, and they would converse with the male guests. These companions, especially the really well-paid ones, they were not just there for sexual favors. They knew poetry, they could sing, they were at least self-educated, and they learned about current events. Women did not receive official sanctioned education. They had to sort of teach themselves. So these companions were a lot like Japanese geishas, you might say. They were very sophisticated women, even though they were sex workers. On the idea of sex in Greek society, men were permitted, even expected to have sex outside of marriage. But they had to do it in very specific ways, at symposia, for example. It was unacceptable, however, for women to have sex with anyone but their husbands, unless they were a companion. And even then, these companions were not usually from the city where they operated. For example, if you were a companion in Athens, you were probably from Thebes or another Greek city-state, or you may have been a non-Greek person who would come in. Basically, these prostitutes tended to be foreign people. And of course, this sort of thing took place in the andron, and what I jokingly call the man cave of ancient Greek society. And the image on this slide is a red figure man. He's playing a game called Kotabos with his kylix, which is a kind of a wine bowl. You drink wine out of this sort of bowl-like glass. And what you would do is you would hold the bowl and you would flick the dregs of the wine at like a target, like a maybe a vase with flowers in it. And whoever hit the target the most, they would get a prize. Maybe it'd be a piece of candy or a sexual favor from one of the companions. It was basically a game that men played in the Andron. A very messy game, by the way, that they would probably would have to be cleaned up by their wives the next day after the party was over, or by their slaves. Remember, their wives and their daughters would not come into the symposia while they were happening. While we're on the subject of ancient Greek symposia, we should discuss ancient Greek musical instruments. When we think of the word symposia or symposium today, we think of a very stuffy event where there's lecturing and there's talking about big political ideas. And to the ancient Greeks, the symposia was a wild party. You might talk about current events and you might have sophisticated conversations with companions perhaps, but you'd also have music and dancing and entertainment, and musical instruments would be used to make this music. The Greeks played stringed instruments like the lyre and the guitarra. The guitarra is a lot like a guitar. You even notice the similarity in the name. They also really enjoyed woodwind instruments, flutes like the aulos, the double flute you can see here. You can also see a lyre and a guitarra. They also had the pan flute or the pan pipes, said to be invented by the half man, half goat Pan. Pan, of course, is the god that we get the term panic from. If people saw Pan, they would freak out and kind of be reduced to their more base urges. Dionysus, the god of wine, is often associated with music, although the real god of music is actually Apollo. Apollo represents musical skill and learning musical instruments, the science of music, music theory, whereas Dionysus represents music for parties and music for fun. They also had a muse that was dedicated to music as well. Of course, muse is where we get the term music in English. They also had a type of bagpipe called the sampuna, which was probably actually from Anatolia. We associate bagpipes with like Northern European or Celtic culture, Scottish culture, but actually the bagpipe is probably from Anatolia in the Middle East. And in a future video, we'll talk about how the bagpipe kind of becomes associated with Northern Europe. But basically, the Greeks had their own version of the bagpipe as well. And they also had tambourines and drums, a variety of instruments. Now I want to mention gender roles in Greek musical performance. Both men and women played music in ancient Greece, and there's actually a muse dedicated to music. The muses, of course, were women, were female. Terpsichore or Terpsichore is the muse of music. Men played stringed instruments and woodwinds. Respectable women, however, would only play stringed instruments like the lyre. The only women who played woodwinds or flutes were companions. And this is probably because the Greeks thought it was too crass for women to play the flute. It was too sexually suggestive. So only companions would have played flutes. Here is a red figure of a woman playing the flute. She's probably a companion of some kind because she's at a symposium. And of course, she's playing an instrument that was seen as being inappropriate for respectable women to play. And this image is from a crater, basically a punch bowl. It was probably made in about the 420s BCE, and it's at the National Archaeological Museum in Spain. It was probably painted by an artist named Nicias. Later in Greek history, later in the classical period and in the Hellenistic period, A lot of artists, potters and painters of pottery began to sign their work. Now I want to shift gears and talk about some of the political and military history that's taking place in the so-called high and later classical periods. First, I want to mention the Delian League. The Delian League was founded in 478 BCE to stop Persian naval advances. So it's founded during the Persian Wars, which we talked about in my last lecture video. The naval alliance was led by Athens. Athens' greatest military strength was in its fleets. The Athenians had hoplites. They had land-based infantry and cavalry, but their strength was in their navy. The treasury originally was at Delos, hence its name. Eventually, though, the treasury is going to be moved to Athens, where it will be more secure, but also where Athens will have more control of the treasury. And the treasury is actually going to, at certain points, be stored on the Acropolis, the most important place in Athens. And after 450 BCE, Athens became a lot more authoritarian. They began demanding much higher tributes from the members of the Delian League. Initially, members would supply ships and sailors to the League, but over time they began to phase that out and said they would just pay money to Athens, and Athens would outfit the ships. But the Athenians began to demand higher levels of tribute, and they also made rules that once you were in the Delian League, you could not leave the Delian League. So really, the Delian League evolved into the Athenian Empire. It's a small empire centered around the Aegean Sea, but it's still an empire in the sense that it's one city-state controlling other city-states far away across the sea. Not far in our modern standards, but certainly far by ancient Greek standards. And the Persian Empire felt very threatened by the Delian League, but so did the city-state of Sparta as well. And the Spartans actually had their own kind of league called the Peloponnesian League, which was centered on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And the growth of the Delian League and it becoming a lot more authoritarian and imperial would help to contribute to the Peloponnesian War of 431 through 404 BCE. Now we'll discuss the Peloponnesian War of about 431 to 404 BCE. The Peloponnesian War was fought primarily between Athens and its allies against Sparta and its allies. Athens is here in the peninsula of Thessaly, and then Sparta is further to the south on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. After the Persian War, Athens wanted to transform itself into a navy-based empire. As I mentioned previously, they reveled in the glory of defeating the Persians. They built the Parthenon. They found silver mines that brought a lot of wealth into the city, and they were trading with people across the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. All of this brought a lot of wealth into Athens, and the Athenians wanted to exploit this wealth and become an empire. They formed alliances like the Delian League to make this happen. Sparta wanted nothing to do with Athens after the Persian War. They wanted to return to life as it had been before the Achaemenid invasion. They'd begun to see Athens as a military threat, but as a cultural one as well. The Spartans didn't like Athenian theater. They didn't like Athenian philosophy. They wanted to keep to an older, more traditionalistic system of oligarchy. Athenian philosophers and playwrights just asked too many questions that were seen as a threat to Spartan culture. Now, Greek city-states had gone to war with each other for centuries before the Peloponnesian War, but these wars had been much shorter and were far less destructive. The Peloponnesian conflict was far more destructive as the Athenians and the Spartans sought to destroy each other's power in a way that previous city-states had not. Most of what we know about the Peloponnesian War was recorded by the historian Thucydides. In the end, the Peloponnesian conflict weakened all of the Greek city-states, setting the stage for the Macedonian invasion and takeover of Greece that happened from 359 to 336 BCE. During the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians and Spartans adopted grand strategies that played to their military strengths, but also to their cultures as well. The Athenians built a strong navy during the Persian Wars, so they were going to rely on a strong navy during the Peloponnesian conflict. They were also going to rely on foreign trade. Pericles, at the center of this slide, was a particular supporter of this naval and trade-based strategy. But unfortunately, Pericles died during the plague of Athens at 429 BCE, at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. Some scholars think that if Pericles had lived longer or survived to the end of the conflict, maybe Athens would have won the war. Sparta, in contrast to Athens, preferred a land-based military strategy, playing to the strength of their hoplites and their training system and their hyper-martial culture. The Spartans preferred to fight on land, and the Athenians preferred to fight on sea, in short. And their allies would follow the lead of their respective city-states. Here is a piece of black figure pottery that portrays a scene from the Peloponnesian War. Here are the fortifications that were built around the city of Athens. These fortifications were part of what provoked the Peloponnesian War. Athens built these fortifications to protect their city from a possible Spartan invasion. The Spartans resented the Athenians' construction of these walls, leading to the beginning of the conflict. At the end of the war, in 406 BCE, the Spartans, led by Lysander, demanded that as conditions of peace, the Athenians tear down the walls around their city, shown at the bottom right of the slide. Although they were both Greek city-states and spoke a similar language and had similar traditions in some ways, the Athenians and the Spartans were also very different from each other as well. Athens was a democracy in which the citizens ruled the city-state. It had a large citizen population as well, although there were significant non-citizen populations of foreigners, chattel slaves, and then women who were not permitted to vote. Athens had a large navy, as mentioned before. It was reliant on foreign trade for its economy, and it was also a very culturally cosmopolitan city-state compared to the other Greek city-states. Sparta, however, was an oligarchy ruled by kings and councils. It had a very small citizen population. The vast majority of the people that lived in and around Sparta were unfree laborers or captives called helots. Helot actually means captive in Greek. And the helots were something between serfs and slaves. They were not bought and sold in the way that the chattel slaves of Athens were, but they were mistreated by the Spartans. The large helot population provided the labor that the Spartans needed so they could focus their male population on military training. Over time, the Spartans would give the helots more rights, including the rights to serve in the military. But Sparta would still continue to weaken even after winning the Peloponnesian War. And in the end, they would be defeated by the Greek city-state of Thebes and eventually by Macedonia. Life in Sparta, in many ways, was difficult for all of its residents. In general, Sparta was a very harsh, authoritarian society. It was an oligarchy, ruled by kings and councils. The Spartans practiced eugenics. They would leave infants with health problems out to die. This was done in other ancient Mediterranean societies, but it was especially important to the Spartans, as they wanted to make sure that they only raised people who could become healthy soldiers, in the case of men, or in the case of women who could give birth to more healthy children. Boys would be taken from their families about the age of 7 to undergo the very brutal agoge military training, which would go on until they were about 20. In this training, the boys would be taught to fight in wrestling and in other forms of martial arts. They'd also be trained how to use hoplite armor and weapons. And if they survived 10 years of military service, they would become citizens around the age of 30. During their agoge training, young Spartan males were taught to steal and even kill the helots. They would only be punished if they were caught. In general, Spartan society was less interested in art, theater, and philosophy, preferring to focus all of its efforts on military training. The origin of certain modern words like Spartan and laconic actually come from ancient Sparta. Spartan, of course, means very rough, simple accommodations. You might say that a room with no furniture is Spartan. Laconic, meaning using few words, is also said to come from ancient Sparta because Spartans did not like to give long, ornate speeches and have big, deep conversations in the way that the Athenians did. Some scholars think that women had more rights in ancient Sparta, being allowed to participate in sports, for example. But women were encouraged to participate in sports so they could give birth to physically strong children. So the Spartans' decision to give their women additional rights was motivated by their militaristic culture, rather than a desire for gender egalitarianism. Here are some scenes of Spartan athletic and military training. We can give the Spartans some credit because they were a bit more egalitarian when it came to gender compared to other Greek city-states. They allowed their women to undergo athletic training. The idea was stronger, more athletic women were supposed to birth stronger, more athletic babies. The idea was they would pass those traits on to their children. Although the Spartans did engage in eugenics and they would leave babies they thought were unfit out to exposure, out to die, there's always a limit to egalitarianism. And the military training that boys underwent, the agoge or the agoge training, of course, was very harsh. They trained from the age of 7 into about the age of 19 or 20. During that training, they fought each other. They stole from the helots, and they were punished if they were caught, not because stealing was wrong, but because they'd been caught. The idea was it was okay to steal from the helots because they were basically slaves. They were tied a little bit more to the land than the typical Greek chattel slave was, but this was not like medieval serfdom, where medieval serfs had some basic rights. The helots had fewer rights. They were really a lot more like slaves, and they were basically dehumanized in many ways by the Spartans. The Spartans, they made them wear like weird clothing made of dog skin. They forced helots to get drunk, to drink too much alcohol, and then they would mock the helots, and they would say, "Children, this is why you shouldn't abuse alcohol, because you'll be like a helot." And then helots were whipped and beaten, not just by the Spartans that owned them, that controlled them, but by any Spartan citizen could beat a helot. And of course, they were stolen from by young boys under military training. And then, kind of the final rite of passage of the military agoge training was the Crypteia, wherein young Spartan warriors in their late teens, early 20s would actually kill helots that they believed were going to rebel. And the harshness of Spartan military training and the harshness of their treatment of the helots is probably because the helots greatly outnumbered. The helots greatly outnumbered the Spartan citizens. There were probably about 7 helots to each one Spartan citizen. By the way, the term helot comes from the Greek word for captive. These were people that the Laconians, the people who would become the Spartans, had basically captured and enslaved. Spartan society included basically the region of Laconia, which is sort of the southern, southeastern part of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. It included Spartan citizens who were part of the Spartan kind of warrior class, the military class. It included metics, a Greek term for foreigners, basically people who were not Spartan citizens but were not helots, and they lived in Laconia. And then It included the Helots, who provided the labor of kind of Spartan society. And obviously, the Helots were treated very badly. It's a very militaristic culture. We think the differences, or some of the differences in Spartan culture and Athenian culture, arose from the fact that Sparta and Laconia were basically founded in about the 800s BCE, sort of the end of the Dark Age, and that basically the Spartans and the Laconians were heavily influenced by Dorian / Indo-European culture, far more so than the Athenians, who were, their culture was influenced by a much older Indo-European wave. Remember, Sparta probably survived the Dorian invasion a lot better than other city-states from the Mycenaean period because of their Acropolis. Basically, Sparta was destroyed and rebuilt during this period, and we think that the militancy of Spartan and Laconian culture was kind of created by the Dorian people who moved into that region. By the way, terms like Spartan for very simple, harsh quarters, Spartan living conditions, this comes from the way Spartan people, particularly Spartan military recruits, lived. They lived a very harsh life. They did not have comfortable homes. They lived in barracks when they were single. They only had homes of their own, like other Greeks, after they got married. They ate a soup made of pig's blood and vinegar, basically this really disgusting black blood soup. So if you were living in harsh conditions, you say those are Spartan conditions. And the term laconic, meaning a person or a speech of few words, comes from Laconia, because the Spartans and the Laconians, they spoke a different language of Greek than other Greeks, particularly the Athenians. They spoke Doric Greek, whereas the Athenians spoke either Attic or Ionic Greek. And they were people of few words. They didn't like long speeches or philosophical discussions. It was said that the Spartans were once being challenged by the Macedonians, and the Macedonians told them to surrender and submit to Macedonia, or else they would be destroyed. And basically the Spartans just said, if you could destroy us. That's where laconic comes from. I also want to mention the Spartan government. It's different than the Athenian government. It's not a democracy, it's an oligarchy, the rule of the few. Basically, they were ruled by an elder council called the Gerousia. And the Gerousia was made up of 28 veteran soldiers, usually men in their 60s, and they were voted into their positions for life by the male citizens. Once again, a very small portion of Laconian or Spartan society were actually citizens. Most of the people that lived in Laconia in Spartan territory were either helots or they were medics, non-citizens. So really a very small electorate in Sparta, ruled by a very small council. Basically, it was these 28 men in the council who ruled alongside two kings. It's a little bit like the future Roman Republic's Senate that was ruled by two consuls. One king would oversee the military, and another king would oversee kind of politics and administration. The king's sons received military training, but they did not go through the agoge military system, because if they failed, which many Spartan boys did, then it would be a disgrace to the king. Warriors in Spartan society usually grew their hair long. They also often shaved their mustaches off, as you can see in the image on the left-hand side of this slide. And this long hair style amongst the Spartans was to symbolize that they were warriors. They were not working people like the Helots. Having long hair if you're working in the fields would have been annoying and irritating. So it showed that they were not working people. They were fighters. And some people actually think that the Spartan men may have worn their long hair in dreadlocks, possibly, because it would have been easier to maintain than just having their hair straight. And now we'll continue with our discussion of the Peloponnesian War. This is a sort of a timeline showing events leading up to the war. You can see the founding of the Delian League here. And then you see that there's a peace treaty between Athens and Sparta, but it doesn't last. Basically, Sparta goes to war with Athens after the Athenians were threatening Megara, a neutral city that was near Spartan territory that was leaning more towards Sparta. Basically, the Delian League and Athens wanted to bring Megara into kind of their fold, and that was a serious threat to Sparta. So the war begins, and it's fought in basically a couple of phases. There's the first phase that ends with a peace treaty, but that only lasts 1 year, and then the war continues again into a second phase. And in the second phase of the war, Sparta is much more having the upper hand in the conflict. The Athenians have an expedition to Sicily that fails spectacularly. It's very costly and destructive. That really does not help Athens at all. Also, Sparta gains support from Persia. Remember, Persia sees the Athenians and the Delian League as a threat, so they support the Spartans. Their former enemies, the Spartans, become their allies, and it was pretty controversial to the Greeks that Sparta sought assistance or gained assistance from the Persians, kind of enemies of the Greek people. But Persian assistance does play a role in Spartan victory over Athens. Remember, the Athenian fleet is sort of the greatest asset of the Athens and the Delian League, but eventually the Spartans begin to build more of a navy with Persian financial assistance, and they do defeat the Athenian fleet, which then leaves Athens open to conquest. And in the end, of course, Sparta defeats Athens. Here is a map of some of the major kind of battles and events in the Peloponnesian War. The Athenians and the Delian League are shown in red, and then blue is the Peloponnesian League, Sparta, and their allies. Gray are neutral territories. What you see is that early on in the war, the Athenians have a more conservative strategy put forth by Pericles. Pericles wanted to use the Athenian naval superiority, basically use Athenian ships to attack Spartan territory, and then Athenian hoplites would get off the boats, attack the Spartan people and their allies, and they would get back on their ships and retreat, kind of hit and run tactics. The Spartans would then respond by invading Athenian territory on land. They would burn Athenian crops. They forced Athenian allied people to flee into Athens. But the Athenians would then import grain and other foodstuffs and supplies from their allies in the Delian League. So the Athenian strategy early on in the war is really reliant on ships. But Pericles' untimely death during the Athenian plague led to the Athenians adopting a more aggressive strategy. Some people think that maybe the war would have gone better for Athens had Pericles survived that plague. We think one of the reasons the Athenians were afflicted by the plague was because so many refugees of the war had fled into Athens to avoid being killed by the Spartans. They were living in cramped quarters. Athenian houses did not have indoor plumbing, and disease spread and killed a lot of people, including Pericles. But after Pericles' death, there's the destructive Sicilian expedition, and then Sparta gains an upper hand in the war and eventually defeats Athens. Some more information about the failed Sicilian expedition. It was led primarily by Alcibiades, but other generals, other strategoi, certainly bore some responsibility as well. And of course, the Athenian voters, the Athenian citizens who voted for people like Alcibiades also bear some responsibility. These generals, they were elected to their positions. Alcibiades proposed a very bold but expensive campaign against Sicily, particularly against Syracuse or Syracusae. But Alcibiades was a young man. He had very little military experience. He was seen as being very arrogant and prideful. Sicily was officially neutral, but culturally speaking, the people who settled Sicily were more like the the Spartans than they were the Athenians. They spoke the Dorian language, Doric Greek, and the Athenians, of course, spoke either Attic or Ionian. So the Athenians attack Sicily, and they're defeated when Sparta sends troops to help the Sicilian Greeks. And of course, this campaign ends in defeat, and Alcibiades is going to be ostracized. He's going to be exiled from Athens because of his failures. And this aggressive strategy it was too expensive. It was not sustainable. Athens was already losing a lot of money because they had to import food and supplies because the Spartans would attack their agriculture. And it's likely that if Pericles had lived, he would not have supported something like this. Pericles would have said we need to not be making a very bold strike like this on Sicily. We should instead use our navy directly against the Spartans instead. And of course, Athens is a democracy. Even as the war turns in favor of the Spartans, the Athenian citizens vote to continue the war. Here are some scenes showing the Athenian defeat at Syracuse, which came largely due to the Spartan reinforcements that the Sicilians received. As time went on, the Spartans became more skilled with their navies, and they could build ships that could then send reinforcements to places like Syracuse. Another interesting and kind of humorous story from the Peloponnesian War about Alcibiades is that he was accused of vandalism. Basically, he was accused of defacing Herm statues. This is a Herm statue here. These were statues that were supposed to be of Hermes, the messenger god. They featured a bust on the top, and then there were male genitals on the bottom. They would be placed at places like street intersections in Athens to prevent collisions, to keep, chariots or wagons from crashing into each other at street corners. There's no traffic lights in classical Athens, so crashes were common. Alcibiades was accused of vandalizing the Herms, knocking off their genitals, and that led to his reputation being damaged. People said that he was prideful, he was haughty, he did not respect the gods, and in the end, Alcibiades is going to be exiled, of course, not just for charges of vandalism, but also for failing as a strategos, as a general. And this Herm actually has the head of Heracles, or Hercules, which is interesting. It's a little bit of a departure from the more traditional Herm style. We should talk a little bit about the military technology and arms and equipment that were used during the Peloponnesian War and shortly thereafter. As time went on in the Peloponnesian War, Greek hoplites began to wear a lot less armor and equipment. They were much more lightly armed and equipped. Instead of wearing breastplates and greaves and a lot of armor, they began to just wear basically simple tunics and shields. These tunics were one-armed, allowing the hoplite to more easily use his spear. Instead of wearing the Corinthian helmet, they began wearing the pylos or pilos helmet, which allows a lot more vision on the part of the wearer, but is a lot less protective. We don't exactly know why they began to switch to more lightly armed hoplites. The general theory is that both the Athenians and the Spartans were just running out of resources. They were running themselves into the ground during this war, and so they couldn't afford to outfit their soldiers as well as they had previously. We also think, in keeping with this theme of running out of resources, the factions in the war, they stopped using servants and slaves to carry their equipment. A lot of hoplites in earlier conflicts, they wore heavy armor and things like this because they had a servant or a slave that would go with them and carry that armor for them. That way they would not have to wear it while they marched. We think that they passed laws forbidding hoplites from bringing slaves and servants because a attendant like that, a slave or a servant, is just another mouth that has to be fed, meaning there's less food for the actual fighting men, for the actual hoplites. So we think that because they had to carry their own equipment, they began to wear less equipment. And lastly, we think that maybe the tactics during the Peloponnesian War were changing. Hoplites wanted to be a bit more mobile in battle, move a bit more quickly, so they wore lighter armor, less armor, so they could move around the battlefield a little bit more easily. And this theory is kind of borne out by Iphicrates' reforms. And Iphicrates, he actually made these reforms in Athens after the Peloponnesian War was over. He called for hoplites to use smaller shields and longer spears, probably so that the hoplites of later periods could move more quickly. He also called for them to wear really good sandals. That way they could move more easily and be faster as well. But Iphicrates' reforms are happening after the Peloponnesian War, and they're probably due to the fact that people began to wear less armor during the war itself. Here is a Spartan funerary stele showing a Athenian hoplite and a Spartan hoplite fighting against each other. This stele features the Athenian hoplite standing above the defeated Spartan warrior. He's about to land the killing blow on the Spartan, but the Spartan is refusing to surrender and is going to stab the Athenian, so both men are going to die. This stele, this piece of art, might be a reference to the Battle of Lycaeum or Lycaeum, in which the Athenians fight against the Spartans, and the Spartans are defeated, but with great losses. The Spartans refused to surrender to a larger Athenian force, and they killed many Athenians even as they died themselves. Spartans, of course, had a reputation for being tenacious warriors, going all the way back to the Battle of Thermopylae, in which the Spartans and their allies refused to surrender to the Persians. And this later stele from the Peloponnesian War depicts that similar attitude towards Spartan hoplites. But as you'll see, both hoplites are wearing a lot less armor. This is probably because of the reasons mentioned on the previous slide: a desire for higher mobility, a desire to outfit warriors for less money, and a desire to not have to carry as much equipment on marches. And I also, thematically, this is a really interesting stele because it just shows the destructive nature of the Peloponnesian War, as both the Athenian and the Spartan are going to die in this image. And this stele would have been placed over the bones and ashes of deceased Athenian hoplites. This stele is probably from about the year 390 BCE, so after the Peloponnesian War is over, and the remains of Athenians who died in battle are being brought back and being reburied in Athens. In the end, the Spartans achieved victory over the Athenians in the Peloponnesian War. This was due to a variety of factors: poor leadership on the part of Athens, people like Alcibiades going on expensive failed expeditions to Sicily, the fact that the Spartans made an alliance with the Persians, giving them extra resources, and the fact that the Spartans, who were known for their land-based military, their hoplites, eventually became good enough sailors to defeat the Athenians, a power in Greece known for strong navies. And General Lysander, shown on this slide here, he will defeat the Athenian navy at Nautium in 406 BCE, opening up Athens to be conquered by Sparta. Sparta will capture Athens. The war ends in 404 BCE. As conditions of victory for Sparta, Athens has to tear down its walls. It also has to give up democracy as well, and it's going to be ruled by a Spartan-backed oligarchy, a lot like the Spartan government. And the Spartan oligarchy that rules Athens basically has a reign of terror in which it treats the Athenian people very poorly, and as a result, Athens will rebel against the oligarchy, and they will return to democracy by 402 BCE. And then they'll rebuild their walls by 391 BCE. And although Sparta won the conflict, they're really weakened by it. They waste a lot of resources on the war. Spartan society had already been struggling for many decades before the war because there's so few Spartan hoplites. There's not nearly enough Spartan warriors and citizens to keep down the helots. It's a very unstable society compared to Athens, which had a much smaller population of enslaved people. Additionally, Sparta may have experienced some natural disasters and crop failures. So Sparta just, even though they win the war, they get weaker and weaker afterwards. And Athens loses the war. They lose a lot of their wealth and prestige, and they lose their Delian League. But Athens is still able to kind of hobble along after the Peloponnesian War. And basically, in the aftermath of the war, neither Athens nor Sparta is going to be the dominant power in Greece. It's actually going to be Thebes. But eventually, even Thebes will be taken over and destroyed by the Macedonians. But we'll talk about that later in this video. Most of the documentation we have about the Peloponnesian War comes from a Greek historian and veteran of the conflict named Thucydides. Thucydides participated in the war on the Athenian side, and he was ostracized after being defeated in battle by Spartan forces. Thucydides argues that he was only defeated because he was not receiving the kind of support he needed from Athens. But he kept very extensive notes on his experiences during the war, although his history does not cover the final 7 years of the conflict in which Athens loses the war. We think that Thucydides is pretty objective and balanced. Even though he was influenced by Herodotus, we generally think that he's a more credible historian than Herodotus was. Some other things to note, Thucydides opposed democracy. He thought it was what provoked the war with Sparta. Thucydides traveled quite a bit and spent some time in Sparta as well. He also opposed the Delian League and Athenian imperialism, thinking it led to the war. He's actually very sympathetic to his enemy, Sparta. And the overall tone of the Peloponnesian War is much more dark and negative than Herodotus' writings, probably because it's a war in which Greeks are fighting Greeks, and then his home city loses. Granted, he had a lot of negative feelings towards his home city because they ostracized him. So it's another very important work, another essential contribution to the founding of history. Anyone who wants to be a historian, not only should they read Herodotus, they should read Thucydides as well. Here is a map showing Theban control of Greece after the Peloponnesian War. The bright yellow is territory that's allied with Thebes. The dark yellow is territory controlled by Sparta. You can see in the dark yellow, the Spartans still control Laconia, kind of their sort of cultural homeland, but they lose a lot of territory on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. In particular, they've lost Messenia. Messenia was basically the breadbasket of the Spartans, and the loss of Messenia only made Sparta weaker. The Spartans may have been good hoplites, but they were just, their society was too weak after the Peloponnesian War. In green, you see what's left of Athens and allied territories. They still have some holdings in the Aegean Islands, but they're not nearly as powerful and as influential. And of course, the areas in blue are not allied with Sparta, Athens, or Thebes. But you can see that the most powerful city-state at this point is Thebes. It's not Athens or Sparta. Although Sparta had won the Peloponnesian War, as we discussed previously, their population continued to decrease after the conflict. The agoge military training was just too expensive. It produced very good, very skilled hoplite warriors, but it just did not produce enough warriors. They were focused way too much on quality and not enough on quantity. There's also some belief amongst military historians that Spartan society was just too authoritarian and restrictive, and once Spartan warriors kind of got out of Sparta, they would give up their military discipline, they would misbehave because they no longer had anybody telling them what to do. That may have also contributed to their weakness after the Peloponnesian War. We see this amongst some Spartan generals who go and fight for Persia. They get into a lot of trouble after leaving Sparta because there's nobody telling them what to do. They're no longer living in restrictive Spartan society. The Spartans will try to prevent their demographic decline by giving more rights to their helots and to their metics, their non-citizens, including allowing helots to serve in the military, but it's not enough. Sparta is going to lose several major battles against other city-states. Perhaps the most destructive was Thebes at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE. You can see here Spartan warriors being defeated by the Thebans. This leads to the Spartans losing control of Messenia, which I mentioned on the previous slide. Messenia was their agricultural center. And what's interesting, though, is even though Sparta was smaller and weaker and less influential, it's actually the last of the Greek city-states to be taken over by Macedonia. But this is really not because Sparta is all that scary and intimidating. It's mainly because to the Macedonians, the Spartans aren't even worth taking over. They've lost Messenia. They've lost so much of their territory and prestige. They kind of just ignore the Spartans for many, many years. So you really see Spartan decline after the Peloponnesian War. One of the keys to Theban military success was a unit called the Sacred Band of Thebes. It was a elite military force made up of 150 male couples, so 300 men. This is a stele showing two members of the Sacred Band. Perhaps these couples were in perhaps a pederasty-style relationship in which there was an Erastes and an Eromenos, an older man and a younger man. Once again, Greeks had a very different, very fluid idea of sexuality, and they had a lot of rules about how men could have homosexual relationships with each other. But either way, the Sacred Band of Thebes, they were the special forces of the Thebans, and they were undefeated for over 40 years. They probably played a role in the defeat of Sparta at Leuctra in 371 BCE, where they made a devastating flank attack on the Spartans, attacking kind of the edge of the Spartan line. The Sacred Band, however, was destroyed by Philip II, Philip of Macedon, in 338 BCE. The Sacred Band refused to surrender to Philip and the Macedonians at the Battle of Chaeronea, kind of like the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. They chose to be killed rather than to surrender. They wanted to die on their feet rather than submit to their enemies. Some think that if the Sacred Band had perhaps found a way to survive, then maybe Alexander the Great would not have been able to destroy Thebes in 335 BCE. During the years after the Peloponnesian War, a lot of Greek hoplites fought outside of Greece as mercenaries, particularly for Persia. I mentioned Lysander fighting for the Persians, but perhaps the most famous Greek mercenary that fought for the Persians was Xenophon, soldier, philosopher, author. He wrote a book called the Anabasis, which was about his soldiers' fight in Persia. Basically, Xenophon and about 10,000 other Greek mercenaries, they fought for Cyrus the Younger of Persia, who was trying to take over the Persian Empire. And at the Battle of Cunaxa, outside of Babylon, the Greek mercenaries in Cyrus's army, they actually defeat Persian king Artaxerxes II. But even though the battle is a victory for the Greeks, Cyrus the Younger is killed. So now the Greek mercenaries are left in hostile Persian territory without a leader, so they have to retreat back to Greek territory. They have to retreat to the Black Sea, and then that way they can sail back home to Greece. And it's a very interesting, a very epic tale of their move through hostile territory, fighting against enemy tribes that are sort of assailing them on all sides, climbing snowy mountains in Anatolia, ultimately to reach the Black Sea and then to go home. So a very interesting account of military history. I also want to mention later classical Greek architecture. Some of these developments were going on as the Peloponnesian War is taking place, and then afterwards. Perhaps the most important later classical architectural development is the Corinthian order of architecture. The Corinthian order is not used in the construction of the Parthenon, even though we think that the first Greek building that had Corinthian columns actually was designed by the same person who designed the Parthenon. It comes probably 20 to 30 years after the Parthenon. And the Corinthian order, it's much more sophisticated than the Doric and Ionic orders. Its capitals are much more ornately decorated. And the Corinthian column, its capital is designed to be seen from all sides. It's decorated on all sides, unlike the Doric and Ionic columns. And the Corinthian order is going to become a lot more popular as the Hellenistic period begins, and Greek architects increase their skill over time. And other civilizations will also really like the Corinthian order. The Roman civilization will really like the Corinthian order, and they'll make some modifications to it. And the Indian civilization in India will also make Corinthian-style columns. Greek culture was carried to India by Alexander the Great's troops, and later Indian architects are influenced by Greek culture, including by the Corinthian order or the Corinthian style. Here are some images of the Temple of Apollo Epicurus at Basae in Arcadia. This temple was built perhaps between the 450s and 420s BCE. It's believed to have the same architect as the Parthenon, and it has the oldest Corinthian column capital that's ever been found. So this is probably the first Greek building that we know of that has elements of the Corinthian order. Granted, the temple is mostly built in the Doric and Ionic orders. The exterior columns are Doric, the interior columns are Ionic, although there is at least one Corinthian column capital. So this is kind of the beginning of the Corinthian order. Now I want to talk about later classical Greek sculpture from the 400s to about the 320s BCE. And I want to mention sculpture again because the sculpture changes, the style changes a little bit from the high classical period when the Parthenon is built to the later classical period after the Peloponnesian War. What you'll notice is that later classical Greek sculpture after the Peloponnesian War, it's a lot more realistic and detailed than the sculpture of earlier periods like the kind of high classical period, or far more detailed than the archaic period as well. There's a lot more poses that are used. Anatomically speaking, the statues are more realistic, more accurate, as sculptors have gotten to be more sophisticated. What you'll notice is that in the later classical period, scholars are much less interested in portraying an idealized, perfect human form. They're more interested in portraying subjects as they actually were. They'll portray different body types, age, etc. They're getting more experimental. They're doing a lot more with their sculptures during this period. There's more of a focus on realism rather than idealism, and this is probably not just due to increasing knowledge and skill on the sculptor's part, but to the darkness of the period as well. Greece has been devastated by the Peloponnesian War. That was a much longer war than Greeks were used to. It was Greeks fighting Greece, so it's much more, Greeks fighting Greeks, much more destructive. And we think that sort of darkness translates into the less idealized style of later classical Greek sculpture. On the positive side, women are portrayed more in later classical Greek sculpture, and occasionally they're portrayed in the nude during this period. Earlier periods, Greek sculptors don't seem to have been comfortable portraying women in the nude. There's a lot of theories as to why this was. Some people think it's the sculptors were learning more about anatomy, particularly female anatomy. Other people think that because Greek society was so patriarchal, it just took a really long time for sculptors to be interested in portraying women in sculpture. But as I mentioned, there's more body types portrayed in later classical Greek sculptures. Younger men, older men, men that are thinner, but also men that are hypermuscular are going to be portrayed. And just like in other periods, these sculptures originally would have been painted. And you'll see a lot of these trends continue into the Hellenistic period as well. On this slide is an image of an athlete scraping olive oil off his skin after exercising. This is a common thing that Greek athletes did. They put olive oil on their skin during athletic competitions. This is actually a Roman copy of the original later classical Greek piece. It was actually probably a bronze originally, but the Romans copied it in marble, and it's in the Vatican Museum, and it's about life size if you want to have a point of reference for size. Here are some later classical sculptures of women. There's a lot more poses that are being used in the sculptures of women. You remember that in the high classical period, like the caryatids, for example, the caryatids are very stiff, their arms are at their sides, and they're basically being used as columns. Here we see more poses with arms outstretched, hands clasping clothing. This is on the left of this slide is a sculpture of an Attic woman from about the late 300s BCE. In the center here is Aphrodite of Knidos from the 300s BCE, and this is one of the first, if not the first, statues of a Greek woman in the nude. A lot of these statues feature a hand covering the genitals. And then on the right is a sculpture of a draped female figure from about 375 to 350 BCE, which is not completely nude, but one of the breasts is displayed. So you can see that there's quite a bit of variety in how Greek women are being portrayed in this period. More styles are being used, more poses are being used, different levels of coverage when it comes to clothing are being used. There's some significant innovations in Greek sculptures of women during this period. Here are some sculptures of Greek men during this period. One very common style of sculpture is the Doryphoros, or spear bearer, basically a man, a soldier carrying a spear. The spear, of course, in this piece has been lost. This piece was probably sculpted by Polykletos in the 440s BCE, so it's earlier in the later classical period. This is also a Roman copy of the bronze original. A lot of sculptures have been lost and they've been copied by the Romans, but we believe that the Romans were very, very faithful in how they copied Greek sculptures. They tried to create them just like how the Greeks made them, although they often made bronzes in marble, but appearance-wise, they're pretty much the same. This is a Hermes with the infant Dionysus from the 400s. It shows a bit more flexible of a pose, arm extended. Unfortunately, this piece has been damaged. Often, the pieces with more creative poses are more easily broken, unfortunately. And then on the right-hand side of this slide is a statue of Hercules, Hercules Phernes from the 300s BCE by Lysippos. It's believed that Lysippos made a lot of sculptures for Alexander the Great. And you can see the different kind of body types being used here. You see that Hercules is very muscular, very broad. He's a big, powerful man, just like the mythical Hercules was. And here Hermes, the messenger god, is a little bit skinnier because he's a messenger more than he is a soldier or a strong man. And then we see that the spearman, a soldier, is kind of in the middle. He's muscular, but he's a bit more defined. He's a bit thinner than Hercules, but he's not as thin as Hermes is. Also, you'll note that the genitals are rather small. Really, throughout Greek history, a lot of Greek sculptors portrayed their subjects with very, very small phalluses, very small penises. We think this is because the Greeks believed that a large penis was a sign of sexual incontinence, that a man with a large penis could not control his sexual urges. So really a male beauty standard actually is kind of the opposite of today. But the Greeks still liked big muscles just like we like them today. So there are some similarities and some differences in how the Greeks thought that men ought to look compared to our ideas today. I also want to talk about later classical Greek theater and how sort of the destruction of the Peloponnesian War impacted theatrical culture. With the fall of Athens, there were not as many new tragedies being written. There were still some being written, but it's mostly older tragedies being reperformed, just because there's fewer resources for arts and things like that. Comedies are still performed, but we have not found any examples from this period. We have the earlier ones that were written before and during the Peloponnesian War, like Aristophanes, for example. We don't have these later classical comedies. And the image on this slide is of a theater, and then a red figure of a stagehand, what we believe is a stagehand, from the 350 to the 340s BCE. There's also some interesting things to think about in terms of later classical Greek pottery. Red and black figure pottery is still used. It seems that red figure pottery remains very sophisticated during the later classical period, but black figure pottery, when it's made in this later period, it's not nearly as sophisticated or skillfully made. When you're dealing with red figures, there's a lot more movement in the figures. They're in different types of poses. They're in the background. They're in the foreground. They're standing in a much more three-dimensional manner. They're not just on a single surface, single plane. This style of kind of multiple ground levels is really used by a painter and artist of pottery named Polygnotos. Sometimes potters during this period would sign their work, so we know who some of the artists are. There's also very detailed decorations as well on these pieces of pottery. The images on this slide, on the left is a crater, basically a Greek punch bowl. This one was designed by Neobid from 460 to 450 BCE. And on the other side of the slide is a skyphos, or a cup, showing the judgment of Paris. You know, Paris, of course, figure from the Trojan War. It's in the black figure style, but it's a much simpler style. It's possible that Greeks were just less interested in the black figure style, so when you do get a black figure piece from this period, it's not very good. It's not very sophisticated. And this piece comes from the basically the region of Boeotia, which is like in northern Greece, and it's from about the mid 300s BCE. Now we'll discuss ancient Greek philosophy, including some of the most important ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Our modern word, philosophy, comes from the ancient Greek terms philosophia, meaning lover of wisdom, and the most famous Greek philosophers came from Athens. Archaeologists and historians think that the Athenian economy, which was based around the agora, or marketplace, a place where people could come and talk and share ideas, inspired the creation of philosophy and the emergence of philosophers. Philosophers asked questions about nature, politics, and knowledge. The most famous way they asked questions was the Socratic method, developed by Socrates, in which the philosopher would continually ask questions of the people he was trying to teach. The philosophers wanted certainty through logic, and they taught at schools called academies. These schools were supposed to be free and were dependent upon donations, although some less reputable philosophers, called sophists, often taught their skills to students for a price. But this was looked down upon in classical Greece, and sophists were widely mocked, especially in comedies, by Aristophanes. Initially, many of these philosophers were unpopular. They were mocked by playwrights, and Socrates was forced to commit suicide because he questioned the existence of the gods and was accused of leading the young people of Athens astray. But over time, philosophers became more accepted. The philosophers' approaches to learning and logic would inspire major innovations in the fields of science, mathematics, and medicine, as seen on the right-hand side of this slide, which shows an ancient Greek physician training students. The roots of Greek philosophy extend back much further than the later classical period. Arguably, they begin with the work of Thales of Miletus. And Thales lived from 624 to 545 BCE, so during the Archaic period. And Miletus is in Anatolia. It's in what is now Turkey. It's not in the Greek mainland, but many Greeks lived in Anatolia. Thales, his city would be taken over by the Persians after his death in the year 494 BC, just for reference. Thales, he learned a lot during the Orientalizing period. Archaic Greek culture is characterized by the Orientalizing tradition, ideas from the East coming to the Greeks and the Greeks kind of taking them and modifying them. So Thales took knowledge of math, astronomy, and etc. from the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians, and basically made it his own and brought it into Greek culture. And Thales began to use this scientific knowledge to question whether the gods or natural processes were responsible for events in nature. Was Zeus throwing a thunderbolt and that was why there was lightning, or was lightning just a natural process? And this kind of questioning gives rise to the Greek philosophy of Socrates, with whom you're probably more familiar. Another important Greek philosophical school is the Sophists, and they were active from the 500s to the 400s BCE. The Sophists built upon Thales' questioning of ideas, and they came to the conclusion that truth was basically relative and based on the individual experience. Sophists often hired themselves out as tutors for sons of wealthy men in places like Athens. And the Sophists taught that arete, excellence, should include public speaking and the art of persuasion. And of course, public speaking and persuasion would have been very important skills in democratic Athens. Anyone who wants to get involved in politics, which anyone can, anyone's a citizen at least, in Athens, they would need to know how to be a good speaker. So the Sophists often trained people to be speakers. And a lot of people kind of criticize the Sophists because they taught their students persuasion. They taught them rhetoric. And people said that basically Sophists were BS artists, and that they taught people how to be persuasive and even to lie all in exchange for money. Later philosophers like Socrates would often be accused of being sophists. And sophists are going to be replaced as a philosophical school by the late 300s, and they're going to be replaced by the followers of Socrates. And some famous sophists include people like Protagoras and Gorgias. And of course, nowadays the term sophist basically means someone who is really good at speaking, really good at rhetoric, but doesn't really have good ideas and is dishonest. So our idea of sophists today is influenced by Greek culture's view of the sophists. Now we'll discuss Socrates, who is a very important Greek philosopher. He was living from the years 470 to 399 BCE. He lived in Athens and was from a fairly well-off background. He was well off enough to serve as a hoplite in the Peloponnesian Wars. He could afford hoplite armor, meaning he was of at least the 200 measure class. And he spent his time after the war wandering around Athens, asking questions of young men, creating what we call the Socratic method of teaching, basically teaching people by asking them questions. And his most famous students include Xenophon, the sort of warrior philosopher that we talked about who fought in Persia, and then, of course, Plato, who you're doubtlessly familiar with. And Socrates did not charge tuition for his training. He trained his students at a place called the Thinking Shop or the Thinkery. Instead, he would accept donations to keep his school running. And Socrates defied common norms about personal experience. He liked to wear shabby clothing, a shabby cloak. He often went around barefoot without sandals. He was said to be balding and overweight. He did not look like this statue of a very attractive, physically fit Socrates. He was said to be kind of a sort of a shabby-looking person. And Socrates also did not write down his own philosophy. He was recorded by followers, especially Plato, who would recreate what Socrates said by writing dialogues. And these dialogues are a lot like a script for a play, if you've read any of Plato's writings. And Socrates questioned everything, including the gods and Athenian democracy. And Socrates was put on trial in Athens in 399 for allegedly corrupting the youth of Athens. He refused to defend himself. He admitted that he did question everything, and that actually, because of his questioning, Athens should pay him because he was training their young people to be smarter. This defense doesn't really work, though, for Socrates, and eventually he's sentenced either to be ostracized or be sentenced to death. He had an opportunity to leave Athens and survive, but he chose to die rather than leave his city. And the historical context here is important. Athens had just lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. They had just reinstated democracy, and they didn't want anyone questioning democracy. They didn't want anyone questioning Athenian society, so Socrates became a very unpopular figure to a lot of Athenians, leading to his death. Here is Socrates in his trial being witnessed by the jury. Rather than denying the charges put against him, Socrates admitted to them and said that he was actually providing a service to Athens. The jury didn't see it that way, and they voted to have him either leave or die. After Socrates' death, Plato kind of takes over as being the most important Greek philosopher. And Plato was from a much more well-off aristocratic family than Socrates. And he studied with Socrates, and Plato's family probably donated a lot of money to Socrates' thinking shop, his thinkery. Unlike Socrates, Plato actually recorded his philosophical beliefs in a series of dialogues in which basically Plato uses his teacher Socrates kind of as his voice. Socrates is kind of represented with really not so much Socrates' ideas, but with a combination of Socrates and Plato's ideas. There were, we believe, some similarities, but also some differences between the ideas of Socrates and the ideas of Plato. For example, we think that Plato was a lot more patriarchal than Socrates was when he discussed Greek society. As far as political beliefs, Plato was very against democracy, and it's not surprising why. Democracy is what led to his teacher being killed. And so Plato, in his probably his most famous work, The Republic, he proposes a system of guardians or watchers who would control his ideal society. He also suggested that his ideal society would be ruled by a philosopher king, perhaps someone like himself. And this philosopher king would be chosen based on his intelligence, based on how skillful he was with rhetoric, based on how knowledgeable he was. And even though there would be a king, there would be no hereditary rule. But he also proposed a system of guardians as well, basically an oligarchy. So it just depends on which of Plato's works you're reading. And guardians could actually be both men or women, but they had to be people who dedicated their life to philosophy. At the same time, though, Plato still had a very patriarchal view of society. He believed that the most important thing that women could do was have children. And guardians would rule their society with absolute power over the military. Basically, the military were called auxiliaries, and then the producers were the poor. So Plato is not supporting democracy. He's supporting a much more socially stratified, much more oligarchic system he thinks will work better than democracy. And there's no checks on the guardians' power in Plato's system. They have to check themselves. They have to watch after themselves to make sure that they follow the laws and behave properly. And this system, of course, is described in Plato's Politeia, or Republic, which is probably his most famous philosophical work. After Plato comes Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, and Aristotle was Plato's most famous student. He expanded on Plato's philosophy, particularly Plato's idea of forms, the idea that there is the ideal form and then there's more corrupted forms beneath it. There's sort of the idea, for example, of a chair. Then there's a really nice chair, like a throne. And then there's a not very nice chair, like a camp stool. And then at the bottom is perhaps a broken chair that no one can sit in, and that's the lowest form. Aristotle also put more of an emphasis on natural phenomena. He applied Socratic and Platonic principles to the study of mathematics, medicine, natural science, etc. So not only was Aristotle a philosopher, he was also a scientist as well. And Aristotle believed that living things, animals and humans, existed teleologically. They existed for the purpose of doing good and having self-improvement. And Aristotle's followers were basically the scientists of the period, although they did not really complete experiments the way modern scientists do today. Aristotle founded a school called the Lyceum at the Apollo Gymnasium in Athens. Remember, other Greek philosophers had schools. Socrates had his Thinkery, Plato had his Academy, and Aristotle had his Lyceum Gymnasium. And Aristotle would eventually tutor Alexander the Great, and he would spread Aristotelian ideas across Asia. Alexander would spread those ideas during his conquest of the Persian Empire. And here's a modern artist's reproduction of Aristotle tutoring a young Alexander the Great. Here is a Renaissance era image of the death of Socrates. The Athenian citizens voted that Socrates either had to leave the city of Athens, ostracization, or face death. Socrates chose to commit suicide by drinking hemlock rather than leave the city of Athens. Potsherds like these were used to cast ostracism votes. Now we'll briefly talk about some of the principles advocated by ancient Greek philosophers. Socrates' most important student, Plato, shown here in this Renaissance era image of the Academy of Athens, questioned the efficacy of democracy. He preferred an aristocratic republic instead, in which a small group of wealthy, intelligent, well-educated people, watchers they would be called, would rule over the people. It's unsurprising that Plato would dislike democracies, since it was a democracy that sent his teacher, Socrates, to his death. Plato's student, Aristotle, shown here, also made significant contributions in the fields of politics and art. Aristotle would also serve as a tutor to Alexander the Great, who we'll talk about later in this video. Both Plato and Aristotle believed that the physical world was innately corrupt, and that spiritual forms were naturally better. This idea may have developed from the ancient Greeks' burial rituals, which were far simpler than those of neighboring civilizations. The ancient Greeks in the classical period and earlier wanted bodies to decompose, as compared to the Egyptians who wanted to preserve the bodies of their dead through mummification. Either way, the ideas of the Greek philosophers, like Plato and Aristotle, spread across Greece, but they really remained associated with Athens. Sparta was especially suspicious of many elements of Athenian culture, especially philosophy. The questions that philosophers asked were a threat to the Spartan oligarchic political system. Many other Greeks still did not like philosophers, believing that they questioned the existence of the gods, or that the philosophers pretended to be wise but that they were actually fools, which was why they asked so many questions. Many everyday Greeks also disliked the sophists, philosophers who sold their skills to students, believing that they taught their students not out of a love of learning, but because they wanted to make money. Here are some images of the archaeological excavation of Plato's Academy in Athens. As you can see, it's much simpler than the Renaissance era depictions of the Academy. Here is the archaeological excavation of Aristotle's gymnasium, or his lyceum. And this would have been a place not only of exercise, of training the body, but also education, training the mind. The Greeks believed in the idea of arete, of excellence in all things, and to be excellent, one not only had to be physically excellent, they had to be intellectually excellent as well. This is another shot of Aristotle's Lyceum. But now I want to get back to the discussion of Greek society as a whole, particularly the Macedonian takeover of the Greek city-states to the south. In the end, Sparta won the Peloponnesian War, and the Greek city-states on the whole were greatly weakened by the Peloponnesian War and subsequent civil wars. These civil wars made the Greek city-states vulnerable to takeover by Macedonia. There is some debate over whether the Macedonians should be considered Greek. For the purpose of this class, we'll consider the Macedonians to be Greek because of the significant cultural similarities and overlaps between Macedonia and the Greek city-states. The Macedonian takeover of Greece was initiated by Philip II, king of Macedonia, or the city of Macedon. Philip II lived from about 382 to 336 BCE. Philip strengthened the Macedonian army through increased military training, and he also gave his soldiers new weapons, like the long sarissa, which was a type of pike. Philip himself was a very hardened warrior. He'd lost an eye in combat, as seen on the image on the right-hand side of the slide. He may have also had a lame leg as well, possibly an injury that he sustained in combat. Philip took advantage of the extremely violent and divisive civil wars in Greece to the south of Macedonia, and he eventually defeated all the major city-states. Philip wanted to take control of the other Greek city-states because he wanted to invade the Achaemenid Persian Empire, but he was assassinated in 336 BCE. His son, Alexander the Great, would fulfill Philip's dream of invading the Persian Empire. Here is a modern artist's recreation of Philippi, a very important Macedonian city. With its Acropolis here, I think it looks a little bit like Minas Tirith from Lord of the Rings. Here's a shot of another important Macedonian site called Pella. And here is an image of the Vergina sun. And the Vergina sun is going to be a very important kind of symbol to the Macedonians. Unlike the Greek city-states, which generally relied on citizen soldiers for their defense, the Macedonian society relied on a professional standing army, soldiers who were basically paid full-time to be soldiers. And this, we think, gave the Macedonians an edge, along with their superior military technologies, their longer spears, for example, which we'll talk about later in this video. Here are some shots of Macedonian arms and military equipment to kind of give you an idea of what their equipment would have looked like. We should also mention what life was like in Macedonia, because I think it has a significant impact on the development of Macedonian culture and why the Macedonians are able to overtake and eventually capture and defeat the other Greek city-states. Macedonia is further to the north than the other Greek city-states. Its topography is very rough, its winters are colder, but it had large forests and mines, allowing the city-state to actually be very, very wealthy. Macedonian society was a lot more militaristic and stratified than the southern Greek city-states. They had a standing army, a professional army. They had kings as well. Not every Greek city-state had kings. The Greek city-states that did have kings, like Sparta, for example, their kings did not live that much differently than their everyday citizens, but life was a lot more socially stratified in Macedonia. The Macedonian society faced a lot of attacks from equestrian cultures like the Thracians. They were also taken over by the Persians temporarily. And we think because of their threats from the equestrian culture and also from the Persians, the Macedonians probably learned to use their longer sarissa pikes rather than like the shorter spears used by the Greek city-states to the south. The Macedonians also avoided the destructive Greek civil wars of the 400s. They chose to remain neutral and outside of them. And as the other Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta, became weaker because they were fighting each other, Macedonia became stronger. Macedonian society was very patriarchal, just like Greek society. Interestingly, Macedonians, at least Macedonian elites, often married multiple women, but they did get married younger, we think, than the Greeks to the south. They probably got married more in their 20s. Their men got married more in their 20s than their 30s. And Macedonian line of successions saw very frequent assassinations and coups, and you'll see that certainly in the life and death of Philip II of Macedon. Here are some images of Macedonian military culture. You see Philip II here arrayed in his armor with his crown. You also see the sarissa pike, basically a much longer spear that's very effective against cavalry. And also it's a better weapon because it's longer. It means that a Macedonian soldier can get a lot closer, can strike his enemy a lot more easily with a sarissa than a Greek hoplite could with his much shorter spear. And also military service was much more of a profession for the Macedonians, meaning that the Macedonian soldiers had more time for military training than a lot of other Greek soldiers. The Macedonians also had a lot of cavalry as well, probably because they were fighting against equestrian cultures around them, like the Thracians. The Macedonians do eventually take over the Greek city-states. Philip II will begin this process by both conquest and marriage alliances. Perhaps his most important marriage alliance was to Olympias of Epirus in 357 BCE. Olympias is the mother of Alexander the Great. And Philip will continue this process of taking over the Greek city-states from 358 to 336 BCE. And Philip's goal was to unite all Greeks under his rule. That way he could lead all the Greeks in a war of revenge against the Persian Empire. Here's a map showing Philip's conquest of the Greek city-states. It took the Macedonians longer to conquer Sparta than it did to conquer the other city-states, as you can see. But eventually Sparta would become a Macedonian subject as well. Here is a Macedonian phalanx with its soldiers armed with the long sarissa pikes. As you can see, there's many tactical advantages to having a much longer pike than a shorter spear. It's much more effective against cavalry, and it allows the Macedonian soldiers to strike other troops much more easily. The Macedonian soldiers still fought in the older Greek phalanx, which provided excellent protection for foot soldiers against faster moving cavalry. Here are some modern war reenactors using reproductions of Macedonian arms and equipment. They have long sarissa pikes, but they have much shorter, much smaller shields than the Greek hoplites in the city-states to the south. They don't need as long of shields because their pikes are so much longer. Their helmets also provide perhaps less coverage than the helmets worn by Greek hoplites, but these less protective helmets allow for much better vision and maneuverability in combat. Although Philip of Macedon was a great warrior who brought many of the city-states of Greece under his control, he died an untimely death thanks to an assassination. This is his tomb at Vergina. It's built in the Doric style with Doric columns and triglyphs, but it also has a painting at the top of the facade. Here is the plan of Philip's tomb site. This tomb, while not as large as, say, an ancient Egyptian tomb in the Valley of the Kings, it is much more ornate than the average Greek tomb. Remember, Greeks in the city-states to the south, even wealthy Greeks, did not have very fancy tombs. But the Macedonians, being a more stratified society, they had nicer tombs for their kings and elite people. Here's a close-up of a reconstruction of Philip's tomb. You can see the colorful facade here, built in the Doric style, and then there's the burial chamber and the grave goods in here. At the Vergina site, there's actually centuries of occupation, centuries of burials, and you can see a variety of grave goods are used over time. These are some early grave goods from a woman's tomb at Vergina. These are probably from the 900s BCE, and I think these goods almost have a Celtic style, which is interesting. The Celts would have been a little bit to the west of the Macedonians. There may have been a cross-pollination of ideas and styles between the Macedonians and the Celts. This is a gorgon, like a Medusa, taken from the breastplate of Philip of Macedon, perhaps to turn his opponents into stone as he was fighting them, or at least to strike fear into them. And then this is an exhibit of just the variety of grave goods found at the Vergina tombs. Some more points to note about Philip II's tomb. It's, as I said previously, much more expansive than the tombs built for most other Greek leaders during the classical period. It shows as this classical period is coming to an end, Greek society is becoming more aristocratic and more socially stratified thanks to the Macedonian takeover. And Philip is buried with very expensive grave goods, armor, a gold casket, crowns, and more. And really this tomb reflects the loss of egalitarianism that takes place in Greek society as a result of the Macedonian takeover, really setting the stage for the much more aristocratic Hellenistic period. And also Philip's remains, his skeletal remains, indicate that he suffered from multiple painful wounds during his life. He lost an eye, he had a badly broken leg. You know, he was a man of war who sustained a lot of injuries during his time as a soldier. And we also know that he was assassinated as well. Here's an image of Philip's skeletal remains, which show some of the health problems he had in life as a result of injuries. His skeletal remains also confirm documentary sources which state that he was assassinated and did not die of old age. After Philip's assassination, Alexander the Great took over the Macedonian throne. Alexander the Great lived from 356 to 323 BCE. During his reign, he strengthened Macedonians' rule over the other Greek city-states. He put down revolts in Thebes and Athens, and then he led a united Greek empire against the Achaemenid Empire. In battle, Alexander the Great consistently faced much larger enemy forces, but he never lost a battle. He was a brilliant tactician, and he adopted many military technologies that were well suited to fighting the Persian armed forces. Alexander initially wanted revenge on the Achaemenid Empire because they had invaded Macedonia and the rest of the Greek city-states. But after actually going to war with the Persians, Alexander showed a surprising amount of restraint and respect towards his enemies, taking the Greeks in a more pluralistic direction as a civilization. During the Archaic and early Classical period, the Greeks had learned a lot from other civilizations. But during the later Classical period, the Greeks developed a more positive opinion of themselves and began to see other non-Greek civilizations as not as good as they were. That changed, though, during the reign of Alexander the Great, who showed quite a bit of respect for non-Greek peoples, similar to the much older, archaic, and early classical periods. Some things to note about Alexander the Great's parentage. Olympias of Epirus was his mother, and she was, of course, married to Philip II. Philip II, like many Macedonian kings, had multiple wives, including Cleopatra Eurydice, who was actually Macedonian. This is not the famous Cleopatra, a different Cleopatra. And Olympias, being that she was a non-Macedonian, she was from Epirus, worried that her son Alexander might lose the right to be Philip's heir because he was only half Macedonian. This has led some people to think that Olympias may have been involved in Philip's assassination because she wanted to make sure that Alexander became king. After Alexander took power, Olympias probably ordered the execution of Cleopatra Eurydice. So she's someone who could be very ruthless to her enemies. And here is the assassination of Philip II. The assassination was actually carried out by a man named Pausanias. You can see here on the slide. He was actually killed in his attempt to escape, so we were never able to find out if Pausanias acted alone or if he had a co-conspirator like, say, Olympias. It's just up to scholars to speculate as to whether he acted alone or not. This is the Macedonian Empire as Alexander the Great comes to the throne. You can see the areas in red are controlled by the Macedonians. It includes Macedonia, shown here. But then you see most of the Greek city-states have been brought under Macedonian control, except for Sparta. Sparta is not going to be captured until later, mainly because Sparta is just not worth capturing at this point. You can see Epirus here is allied with Macedonia because of the marriage between Philip and Olympias, and this just gives you an idea of Macedonian territorial holdings at the time of Alexander's ascension to the throne. After taking over the throne as a young man, Alexander had to consolidate his power. He secured Macedonia's northern border at the Battle of the Carts, showing off his skill as a military tactician very early in his life. He also put down revolts in Illyria. Illyria is another part of the northern holdings of Macedonia. And he also put down revolts in Thebes and Athens about 335 BCE. It's also interesting to note that at this point in his reign, he's actually receiving some money from Persia, although eventually Alexander will go to war with Persia. And Alexander destroyed the city of Thebes. He basically had it razed in order to intimidate other Greek city-states into obeying him. Athens also revolted, but Alexander did not have Athens destroyed. Instead, it was forced to basically give up its democracy by 322, 13 years later. Technically speaking, this is after Alexander the Great had passed away. Some interesting things to note about the Athenian revolt. It was led by a man named Demosthenes, who was a very good orator and speaker. A lot of later orators, especially Roman speakers, would copy Demosthenes' speech style. Demosthenes had criticized Philip II's takeover of Greece in the 330s, particularly after the 338 Battle of Chaeronea. After Philip's death, Demosthenes criticized Alexander as well, calling him a fool and a boy, saying that he was not experienced and he wasn't intelligent enough to be king. And he encouraged Athens and surrounding territory to revolt against Macedonia. And Athens and Thebes do revolt in 335, but many other Greeks just don't join in on the revolt. They see that Macedonia and sort of Macedonia's kind of pan-Hellenic plan for controlling all of Greece as being a stabilizing force. It brings peace to Greece, it ends these civil wars, even if it means that these city-states are no longer independent. So the average Greek city-state is choosing stability over freedom and independence, and so they don't join Athens and Thebes in their revolt. Another reason that the other city-states may not have revolted was because Alexander claimed that he was the son of Zeus. So city-states, by surrendering to Macedonia and Alexander, were not really giving up their independence so much as they were just pledging their allegiance to the gods. But obviously, wealthy, educated aristocrats like Demosthenes did not believe this, and he called for Athenian and Theban revolts. But the average everyday Greek person who had more faith in the gods elected that it was a much safer decision just to submit to Alexander because of his claims of divinity. So what you see is that Demosthenes is able to inspire Athens and Thebes to revolt, but other city-states don't join them. Alexander the Great, seen here, orders the destruction of Thebes in 335 BCE to be basically an example to the other Greek city-states of what will happen if they revolt. Athens, of course, is not destroyed, it's punished in other ways. And now we'll come to the conclusion. We'll talk about Alexander the Great's war against the Persians in the next video. The ancient Greek civilization experienced a golden age in the years following the Persian War, but preceding the Peloponnesian War. But throughout this period, the later classical period, there's numerous Greek cultural developments related to architecture, things like the Corinthian order, Greek theater, and sculpture and philosophy. The Peloponnesian conflict, though, between Athens and Sparta and other civil wars between the Greek city-states will lead to a lot of violence and destruction, and afterwards Athens is going to be a lot weaker, Sparta is going to be a lot weaker, and the Greek city-states are going to lose their independence and be taken over by Philip II of Macedon and then by Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great will then lead Greece in his war against the Persians.